Welcome to the Manly Saints Project with me, Hugh Hunter. We live in a world that struggles to understand the virtue of manliness. Our culture doesn't provide young men, or any men for that matter, with a lot of positive male role models. But our Christian tradition can provide such role models. The stories of the saints provide example after example of manly virtue. Telling these stories is what the Manly Saints Project is all about. If you enjoy my work, please consider signing up and supporting me on Substack, or click the link in the show notes to buy me a beer. And if you enjoy the podcast as audio or video, please consider giving me a rating wherever you are. It helps a lot. Now, let's meet this week's Manly Saint. Join me today to meet the saint who became a hero of the Hungarian people. Name: Ladislas, Laszlo. Life: around 1040 to 1095 AD. Status: saint. Feast: June 27th. The huge army of the Cumans had invaded Hungary. Or at least they were identified as Cumans in Mark of Calt's illuminated chronicle of the deeds of the Hungarian people, usually just called the Illuminated Chronicle for short. Modern historians have argued that the invaders were perhaps a different set of Turkic raiders. Whoever they were exactly, their forces had pressed into Hungary, and the lords of the land had come out to meet them. At the head of the Hungarian forces was the king, King Solomon, and with him were the two powerful dukes, who were also the king's cousins, Duke Bela and his little brother, Duke Ladislas. The raider warlord surveyed the smaller Hungarian forces and concluded that the advantage lay with him. He contemptuously said, "Let the young men go forth against the harmless Hungarians and play with them a game of war." The warlord soon found that he had underestimated the power of the smaller Hungarian army. The Hungarian riders punched through the lines of skirmishers that the raiders sent out. But the warlord was an experienced commander, and he reacted smoothly. He pulled his men back and sent his powerful archers up the side of a mountain. Their elevation let them aim down at the Hungarians. The Hungarians could not endure this storm of arrows for very long. The Illuminated Chronicle zooms in on three men involved in what happened next. King Solomon realized that he would have to get to those archers and ordered his men to charge forward. He himself rode straight at the archers, taking the hardest route right up the mountain. Solomon's horse was practically crawling along, picking its way forward as arrows whipped around him. But battle fury fueled the king, and he pressed on until he was in the midst of the archers, cutting down his foes. King Solomon's cousin, Duke Geza, took a few extra moments to consider the situation. He saw that there was a side path up the mountain. He led his men up the sideway, staying out of the thick of it until he burst in among the archers. It was clever, although perhaps not fully as courageous as the king's frontal attack. As for Duke Ladislas, the Illuminated Chronicle tells us that he got up the mountain somehow and soon found himself surrounded. He tried to stay moving to make it difficult to target him, cutting down 4 enemy archers before one finally was able to aim and fire. The 5th archer shot him point blank, wounding the Duke badly. Even wounded, Ladislas cut down his enemy and kept fighting. The raider warlord had not expected this suicidal charge, and his men began to break. As the Cumans, or whoever they really were, pulled out, Duke Ladislas saw one raider grab a pretty Hungarian girl and pull her onto his horse as he rode away. Acting on instinct, Ladislas urged his tired horse forward and rode after the man. As he pursued the kidnapper, it soon became clear to Duke Ladislas that his horse was as exhausted as he was. He couldn't close the gap and get within range of the raider. Desperate to help the girl, Ladislas shouted a plan to her. He told her to grab the raider's leather belt and then jump off the horse. The girl did what he told her to do, and soon she and her abductor tumbled into the grass as the raider's horse sped away. The plan had worked. Duke Ladislas slipped off his own horse and approached, planning to spear the raider on the ground and finish the fight quickly. But now that she felt safe, the girl suddenly felt sorry for the man who had just tried to abduct her and tried to stop Ladislas from killing him. "Whence it is to be seen," sniffs the author of the Illuminated Chronicle, "that there is no faith in women." The delay gave the raider time to get back on his feet and attack. Now the girl was happy to get out of the way and let Ladislas fight for their lives. It was a hard fight, especially with the arrow still lodged in his body, but eventually Ladislas prevailed and killed the raider. He and the girl he had saved limped back to camp. The Hungarians had won, and Hungary had survived another raid. How things could change in a century. Only 100 years before, the Hungarians had been the ones doing the raiding. Before that, the pagan Magyar people, who had become the Hungarian nation, had migrated west. Their westward movement had stopped when they ran into the military might of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. The Western Roman Empire had once made the fatal error of allowing barbarians to migrate into their lands. Byzantium was not about to repeat that mistake. For a while, the Hungarians had lived as raiders on the border of the empire. Back then, Europe had trembled before news of Hungarian raids. They had raided far to the west, raiding the monastery of St. Gall in modern St. Gallen in the north of Switzerland, martyring St. Viborada, but leaving the dim-witted monk Haribald, who had no idea what was happening, unharmed. He would later report that the Hungarians liked to laugh and seemed a jolly lot. But then, in 955, the German King Otto, wielding the spear of destiny that had belonged to his patron St. Maurice, crushed the Hungarian army. This defeat, along with the example of Byzantium, began to provoke a change within Hungary. Hungarians united under a king, and soon their great king and future saint, King Stephen, brought the Hungarians to Christianity. Hungary was becoming another Christian kingdom in early medieval Europe. Unfortunately, since the time of the great Saint Stephen, Hungary had not thrived. For the last 40 years, they had not found a good king, at least not one who stayed on the throne very long. King Bela had ruled well, but only 3 years into his reign in 1063, he had died. King Bela had 2 sons, Geza and Ladislas. They seemed like natural heirs, but instead the crown passed to their cousin, Salomon. Why had Salomon become king? The Illuminated Chronicle said it was a matter of alliances. Salomon had locked down the support of the powerful king of the Germans, to the point where Geza feared that challenging his cousin for power would be a death sentence. And so it was Salomon who became king, and Geza and his little brother Ladislas remained dukes, helping Salomon defend the land against raiders. Salomon was not a very good king. This is the clear message of the Illuminated Chronicle, which blames most of what happened next on the king's counselor, Vid, detestable in the eyes of both God and men, according to the Chronicle. But a king who heeds bad counsel surely bears some of the fault, and this seems to be the opinion of the careful contemporary observer, Bernold of St. Blasian, who simply writes that Salomon was most unworthy of the royal dignity. Even so, Salomon had led his men to victory against the raid of the Cumans. After defeating the archers on the mountain, there were 3 years of relative peace. Then a different Turkic group arrived, the Pechenegs. At least this time the Hungarians had someone to blame. The Pechenegs were allies of Byzantium, and the Byzantines were allowing or even encouraging them to raid Hungary. And so Salomon summoned his armies again, and they pursued the Pechenegs, crushing them and chasing them south back to the Byzantine base from which they were operating, the city of Belgrade in modern Serbia. Soon, the Hungarian army captured Belgrade. The Byzantine Duke Nicetas solemnly walked out to surrender, holding aloft the most precious thing in the city, a silver icon of Our Lady. Duke Nicetas surprised everyone by surrendering to Geza personally, rather than to the Hungarian king. The Illuminated Chronicle suggests that the Byzantine was counting on Geza's honor to keep him safe. Maybe. But Byzantium had survived for a long, long time by learning how to sow dissent among their enemies. After the surrender of Duke Nicetas, Byzantium turned over Hungarian prisoners again into the personal custody of Duke Geza. If there was not a gap between Geza and his cousin the king before, there was certainly one now. For a while, the conflict between the king and the duke remained cold. According to the Illuminated Chronicle, the king's advisor Vid, the detestable, kept pouring poison in his ear. The king called both dukes together on campaign, but by now they were worried he might try to kill them both together. Geza only led half of his army, leaving Ladislas at home with enough men to come to his rescue. It was pretty clear that the dukes were expecting something to happen. According to the Illuminated Chronicle, King Solomon made the first move. It would play out in a tale of heroism and truly medieval skullduggery. The story began when King Solomon was in a monastery, and he and his close advisors sat in a room alone to hatch their plan. Vid had learned that Ladislas was abroad, and Geza was about to head out on a hunting trip. He told the king that the moment had come. His plan was to ride out in force to capture Geza while he had only a few hunters around to defend him. The king could catch Geza, strip him of his dukedom, blind him, and then deal with Ladislas when he arrived. Vid knew the king would need a loyal man to take over as duke, and Vid generously volunteered his own services in this regard. For some reason, the Illuminated Chronicle said Vid had gained a strange hold over King Solomon. For Vid ruled the ruler as a master his disciple, and against any law the king was as if subject to him by law, which all men should avoid, but kings in particular. The king was duped by the evil counsel of the treacherous Vid, and set his army in movement against the duke. But little did the plotters know, the abbot of the monastery was fiercely loyal to Geza. The unassuming abbot had directed the king and his advisors to the particular room in which they sat, because beside it was a tiny listening post. The abbot himself squeezed into this small secret room and pressed his ear to the wall so that he heard everything. Now he sent a messenger to Geza, telling him not to go on his hunt. The messenger arrived and told Geza of the plot against his life. But Vid had considered that something like this might come about, and had already corrupted several of Duke Geza's advisors. When they heard the message from the abbot, they laughed it off. They told Geza that the abbot was a famous drunk, and prone to sending off paranoid communications when he was in his cups. Geza believed them, and went on his hunt anyway. When the abbot saw that preparations were being made for the strike, he realized that his messenger had been ignored. So, the abbot disguised himself as one of his own monks on a routine errand and snuck out of his own monastery. When he was safely out of sight, he rode hard for the woods where Duke Geza was hunting. He got there in the early morning and found the duke in his tent and woke him up. Here was the abbot himself, obviously not drunk, and Geza realized that he had been deceived. He hurried back to gather some men. But Vid had prepared for this too. When Geza's force faced the king's army, most of Geza's men defected on the field. What Vid had not reckoned with was courage. The tiny fragment of Geza's army that had remained loyal fought so hard they killed many of the traitors and held the king's men at bay. Geza was able to escape. Soon, Ladislas had returned, and the two brothers made their preparations for the battle that they knew was coming. It was a difficult situation. Both brothers were uncomfortable rebels, but then the king had attacked them and left them little choice. Before the battle, Duke Ladislas lay prostrate as he prayed for guidance and help for his brother. Ladislas had a vision of an angel placing a crown on his brother's head. This was encouraging, and Ladislas realized that it was his duty to do everything necessary to help his brother win, even if it cost his own life. And so the brothers switched standards. Ladislas held up the heraldry of his older brother, knowing that this would provoke the king's fiercest attacks. In the battle, King Salomon did indeed attack Ladislas and his men. He was pressing in close when the king, who after all knew Geza and Ladislas well, realized that he had been tricked. But now it was too late, as Geza's men moved in with a pincer attack and the royal army broke. King Salomon fled. The two dukes had won. This was victory, but it was victory over their own people. The illuminated chronicle says that Ladislas rode slowly through the field, looking at the bodies of his fellow Hungarians as tears streamed from his eyes. He found the body of Vid on the field as well. But even for this implacable enemy, Ladislas only had words of forgiveness and regret. King Salomon was not dead, but soon Ladislas had him holed up in the west, in modern Bratislava. Geza called himself king, and the country was happy to agree. Geza awarded himself the title Geza the Great for short, which is what would be minted on his coins. But then, in 1077, Geza died suddenly. Hungary found itself in the awkward position of losing the man who had claimed to be king, and had been treated as king by many other powers, while the actual king was penned up by Duke Ladislas. What should be done? The nobles consulted and came to a decision. Ladislas would be made king, this time properly. Ladislas himself seems to have been surprised and hesitant, but he took on the role, determined to rule well. King Ladislas was uncomfortable about the situation with Salomon. He tried to make things easier by giving Salomon a generous pension and treating him with respect, and perhaps even moving toward a power-sharing arrangement. But Salomon didn't want to share power. He wanted it all. A few years into Ladislas's reign, Salomon found allies to help him take power back. It was the Cuman raiders. He brought them into Hungary, where they met the army of King Ladislas and were destroyed. Salomon once again fled before Ladislas, and this time Salomon fades out of history. A few sources make suggestions about where he went. One source says he died fighting the Byzantines, whom he blamed for all his troubles. But the story I prefer has it that after the defeat, Salomon and the few men he had with him stopped by a forest near the Danube. Salomon laid his shield on the ground and walked into the forest. His men expected him to come back, but as time passed, he did not return. When they followed along the path that he had taken, they found Salomon's armor and heraldry discarded in the woods. He was gone. But if the men had been watching on the other side of the wood, they would have seen a humble pilgrim emerge, as I imagine it, with a new spring in his step. In this version of the story, Salomon the pilgrim would walk the land he had once ruled in prayer and penance, staying on the road for years, and being spotted in churches even after the long and peaceful reign of Ladislas had come to an end. As Ladislas settled into his role as king, he did what no king had been able to do for 40 years. He brought stability and peace. Ladislas understood that peace came through strength. He marched against the Rus and the Poles and the Czechs, establishing that Hungary was not a power to be trifled with. When he besieged Krakow in Poland, Ladislas ran out of food for his army. He knew that the people of Krakow were starving as well. So one night, the king had his men make a huge pile of earth and then had his stewards cover the top of the mound with what remained of their flour. In the morning, the horrified citizens of Krakow saw the besiegers sitting next to what seemed to be a gigantic pile of flour, enough to feed them for the foreseeable future. With provisions like that, they reasoned, the siege would never end. Krakow surrendered. By the end of Ladislas's reign, Hungary was peaceful and prosperous, and the king's fame had spread. The Illuminated Chronicle says that he was invited to become Holy Roman Emperor, but turned it down, although this story is hard to square with the dates of his reign. But it was true that the eyes of Europe were now upon Hungary. It's easier to believe that Ladislas was identified by many as a potential leader for a certain grand expedition. To avenge the injury done to the Almighty God, and to free the holy city and the most holy sepulchre from the hand of the Saracens. Therefore, they asked the glorious king that on their behalf he should be their leader and commander of the army of Jesus Christ. When the king heard this, he rejoiced with a great joy. The expedition was what would become known as the First Crusade. With King Ladislas in the lead, the crusade would have had a leader who understood Byzantium without being beholden to it. They might have avoided the terrible misunderstandings that turned what was supposed to reconcile East and West into further division. But this was not to be. King Ladislas died in 1095, the year the Crusades would begin. He had ruled wisely and well for 19 years. It had been a good 19 years, and the Hungarian people would never forget the saintly king who had stabilized their land and served as an example of Christian rule. They remembered him as a warrior, a hero, and more than that, a father to his people. We can leave the last word to the Illuminated Chronicle. The fear of God was always before his eyes in all his judgments. Because he was enlightened by divine inspiration, he knew that a king does not rule, but rather is ruled. Therefore, in all his judgments, he tempered the severity of the laws with the gentleness of mercy. He consoled the afflicted. He raised up the oppressed. He was a loving father to the orphans. All of his subjects called him, instead of by his own name, the pious king. If you enjoy this podcast, you might also enjoy Tradition Magazine, a new venture I've started with some friends. It's a quarterly Substack and audio podcast. Each edition is built around a single theme. The theme for our first edition is marriage. So, in this edition, you'll hear from voices from the past, St. Augustine, G.K. Chesterton, St. John Chrysostom, as well as medieval ghost stories and other such sources, and also contemporary voices like Charles Coulomb, Leon Podles, Aaron Debuscher, Bonnie Landry, and many others. This quarter's podcast is 5 hours long. You can find it on your favorite podcast player at Tradmag, or you can read it at tradmag.substack.com. And there's more. If you're curious about my thoughts on the Manly Saints, you can check out an interview I did on the Making of Man podcast with Matthew Rodriguez. Links to all of this will be in the show notes.